You're listening to TIP.
Since public markets have existed, there have been occurrences where new and existing owners fight for control of the business. In many cases, these boardroom disputes are resolved with marginal friction. But sometimes, these corporate raiders and takeovers result in dramatic changes and intense learning experiences. Today, we have an incredible guest on the show, and his name is Jeff Gramm. Jeff owns his own hedge fund and is also an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, where he teaches Benjamin Graham and Buffett-style value investing. Jeff is the author of the book, Dear Chairman, which is an incredible account of some of the biggest boardroom disputes and battles that have happened in America. He profiles boardroom battles from investors like Benjamin Graham, Buffett, Ross Perot, Carl Icahn, and many others. In the middle of the interview, we asked Jeff about this interesting story that happened to him where Warren Buffett actually mailed a signed copy of his own book and let him know how much he enjoyed reading it.
We wanted to do an episode about shareholder activism. In other words, what do you do if you're not satisfied with the management in the company that you own stock in? And to do this, we talked with Jeff. And Jeff has studied the best investors out there and how they practice shareholder activism. So we look at the learning outcomes from that, but also what you can do as a retail investor if you're not happy about the management.
You are listening to The Investors Podcast, where we study the financial markets and read the books that influence self-made billionaires the most. We keep you informed and prepared for the unexpected.
Fantastic to have everyone with us this week. As we said in the introduction there, we are with Jeff Gramm, the author of Dear Chairman, and the book is all about boardroom battles and the rise of shareholder activism. Stig and I both read this book. We loved this thing. Jeff, your writing is fantastic. We are thrilled to have you here on the show, so really appreciate your time coming out.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
So, Jeff, I'm going to start off by asking, because the book is different than a lot of investing books that we write, because it's very focused and it's telling the story of what it's like to be inside some of these boardrooms and see what some of these battles that take place. So my first question for you is, what gave you the inspiration or the motivation to go out and write a book like this one? Just tell us that story. What motivated you to write this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, my initial idea for the book was just to collect activist investor letters and to basically, compile them into a book and perhaps like provide a little bit of commentary, but, basically to make it a compilation. Like, I teach investing at Columbia on the side, and like as a part of that, I, have collected like a lot of these activist letters, and I give them to my students for readings. And so that's the way that the idea began. And, it ultimately turned into a history book, to a narrative history that, revolves around these 8 cases with, Ross Perot and GM and Ben Graham and the Northern Pipeline Company, Buffett, American Express. Like, it is a narrow topic, right? I mean, shareholder activism is not something that lots of people, care too much about. And, I tell this history, but I try to use that as a launching point, for broader discussions about business.
I have to admit, having read through the book, the stories about Ross Perot and whenever he got a seat on the board, those were so funny, like listening to some of the stories and like the stupidity that he had to put up with whenever he was on the board.
The history of GM is just incredibly rich, right? And so to be able to kind of like to tell the story of the rise of GM, then the decline of GM, and then the involvement of Perot, it gave me the opportunity to impart like a lot of business lessons and to use these extremely, entertaining people like Ross Perot in the process of doing it.
Yeah, and Jeff, I think that's a good segue to our next question, because basically what we learn and how it should be is that managements, they're representing the shareholders' interest. But as you point out multiple times in your book, you really reveal how hard it is to enforce this in practice. The management have multiple tactics to discourage takeovers from activist investors. Could you take us through some of the mechanisms about them I'm specifically thinking about the poison pills and the green mail that you mentioned a few times in your book, and perhaps also tell a story about how one of your activists in your book faced these challenges.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because, like with takeovers, is that the management often loses their job, right? You can have a situation where it is in the shareholders' interest to sell the company, but the management is, strongly opposed to it. So, yeah, like the two mechanisms that you brought up. So there's green mail, which is essentially when the company, buys out the activist investor. And so in the old days, like Carl Icahn came to your door and is like, I own 9% of the company, and I'm gonna we'll push you into a sale process. What the company would often do, and in fact, like in Icahn's, first 12 or so investments, I think that this happened over 5 times, is they just bought out his particular stake at a big premium. So the stock could be trading at $20. And the management and company would essentially be like, hey, we'll pay you $35, a share for your stake, and then like you go away. And if you think about that, that's like incredibly unfair to the other shareholders, right? It's like you're basically taking like the company's cash to overpay for shares to entrench the management team. So greenmail is now like, it's not technically illegal, but it's essentially been outlawed, through changes in the tax rules and also just like the liability aspects of it. The poison pill is, very much around still. It's now the poison pill is a mechanism for preventing a shareholder from crossing a particular threshold of ownership. So in lots of companies, it can be, at 5, 10, 15, or 20%, where if a shareholder goes over to, that threshold, if they cross 10%, then there's a triggering event that causes a dilution of only that shareholder's stake. And it's a very controversial thing. Like a lot of activists think that like essentially it's a legal mechanism that allows for, what's effectively a change in corporate law. But the poison pill, like it's not always against the shareholders' interest to have the poison pill in place. And there's actually a case that I talk about where I owned 30% of a public company and the stock was extremely undervalued and I was continuing to buy. And the board of directors decided to put in a poison pill to prevent me from buying more shares. As an activist in that stock, it was very frustrating because I wanted to buy more. But at the same time, there was a very clear argument that keeping me from getting to 50% at a bargain price like is in the shareholders' interest. Now, I would argue that like I'm a good guy, and if I get to 50%, like I'm not gonna screw people over. But not all activist investors are like that.
So Jeff, whenever you say that in your example, you said if they get over 10%, then the shares get diluted. Are you specifically talking about the dilution of the voting rights?
No, it's the ownership rights too. I mean, like it depends. Like, there's a lot of ways to structure the poison pill, but now like the way they are typically structured is like they're called a rights agreement. And if a shareholder crosses the threshold, so let's use 10% as an example. So say I want to buy a public company, like if I'm trying to buy into Target, and if they have a 10% poison pill at 10%, like if I accidentally will cross that 10%, if I'm not, paying attention, and I get to, to 11%, it triggers an issue of rights to buy more shares for everyone except for me. And so basically, I just get completely diluted, depending on the ratios in the rights agreement. But it basically means that I can't do it. Like if I cross that 10%, it decreases the value of my stake.
Hey, so Jeff, I've heard that you received a signed copy of your book from the one and only Warren Buffett. And Buffett signed your book. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. So first tell us the story of getting this pleasant surprise, but also talk to us about the story you tell in the book about Warren Buffett and his unpopular way of dealing with the board at Coca-Cola. It was a lot of people were not happy with the way he dealt with the board, but It was a very elegant way. I really like the way that you described this in your book because I think you gave him a lot of credit where other people weren't.
Yeah, like I just got it like a couple months ago. Like I got to work and there was like that book in the mail. Yeah. So he wrote like a very nice note on the front, and then he also put a note in the acknowledgments, where I talked about him. I mean, it's a funny story actually. Like when I finished the book, I had sent him a copy, and I remember as we were doing the pre-release, I wanted to send one to Carol Loomis. I'm like a very big fan of hers, and I tried to track down her contact info through friends, but she had retired from Fortune, and I think I emailed her Fortune email and it bounced back. So I just decided to email her Berkshire, email that's in the annual letter, for questions at the annual meeting. So I sent her this email, hey, I wrote this book, I'd love to send it to you. And I think that she checks that extremely infrequently. So a month or so later, I got this email from Carol Loomis, and it was apologize about the slow reply. I just got email, I've actually already got your book because it was highly recommended to me by Warren Buffett. Oh my God. I mean, I was just the rest of the day, I was on cloud nine, and this was October before the release date in February. And so I was just oh man, this is it. I don't have to do anything. If he likes it and talks about it, then people will, will find out about it. And so I got that email and I just thought, I'm home free, Buffett likes it. And then nothing happened. I never, he never talked about it. It didn't get picked for Bookworm. And then Carol actually asked a question about the book at the meeting the next year. And he, will give it a great answer, but he didn't, say, oh, that's a good book, So then I began to question, well, does he actually like this book? It's interesting because when you put out a book, it sits around for a long time. There's a lot of time to kind of, think about the possibilities. And I for sure thought, well, maybe he'll talk about it in public and I'll get the Buffett bounce. And, that never did happen. But the whole thing has been extremely fun.
That's awesome. I can only imagine how fun it would be to hear that somebody like Buffett endorses your book. And just so the audience knows, Jeff's book is not just being endorsed by Buffett and Carol Loomis. You got Andrew Sorkin, who's endorsed the book. You got Alan Greenspan, who's endorsed the book. You got Charles Schwab, who's endorsed your book. So you got a lot of heavy hitters in your corner, my friend.
In a funny way, those endorsements, they don't actually move that many copies, so the key is just to try to get out there and to get the book out there. But let me tell you about the Coca-Cola thing too. I neglected the second half of your question. Coca-Cola agreed to this compensation plan for its senior management that was pretty egregious in the eyes of shareholders, and you saw some shareholders get extremely angry about it. Will vote against it, go public about it. And Buffett, who was, had been on the board, his kid was on the board at the time. He was, I think, the largest, shareholder, did not publicly oppose the plan. He just called the CEO and explained hey, this is a little bit too aggressive, on the compensation. And the following year, they replaced that plan. So it never got enacted. Carl Icahn was extremely offended by that tactic. He basically feels look, we're too nice to management team. If a guy Buffett, who's the biggest, shareholder and was on the board a long time, so much of investing and being in business in general is about your personality, and you tailor your tactics to what what works with your personality. And I just think that's the way that that Buffett operates.
I think it's an interesting point that you bring up about matching your personality with your investment style. And I think there's a reason why you have some people that are value investors and other people call them growth investors and whatnot. Because I remember Preston and I reading the books from, actually one of them was about Carl Icahn. I think the name of the book was King Icahn. And then we also read the T.I. Pickens book. And I just remember reading through those books, and it's these two gentlemen, they must just be miserable. The way they approached other people, and having you say that, you're probably right. Perhaps it was the only way for them to get there where they are today, because that's just how they handle things. That is what they're consistent with. They probably couldn't use Warren Buffett's tactics, just like Warren Buffett couldn't use their tactics in terms of getting what they wanted.
Well, what I really liked about how you presented it in the book, Jeff, was Buffett was able to get exactly what he wanted from the deal, but he went about it in a much more indirect way. And I think that it talks about his finesse, his business finesse that so many people don't have, because in the long run, whenever he wants to do something again in the future, 5-10 years later, he's going to still have that connection in place. He didn't burn that bridge. He still has that connection in place to achieve what it is that he wants to do. And whereas so many people would have been short-sighted or would have only been looking at something in the short term in the way that they handled the situation, and it would have totally burnt that bridge for future engagements later on. And that's, I really learned a lot from your book reading that specific section, because I remember when this Coca-Cola thing went down. In fact, I think Stig and I were out at the shareholders meeting when everybody was, they were beating them up that year over this question of how.
Yeah, there were lots of questions about that.
Yeah, people were, tons of questions. Why did you vote this way? And during the meeting, you didn't get a sense that he handled it appropriately. But the way you described it in the book and the way that you explained why he acted the way he did and what he actually achieved in the end, I'd never read that or seen that anywhere else. So I really gained a lot of value out of that in your description in the book. It was very good.
My next question is also about Warren Buffett. And I just want to point out there that Jeff's book, there's a lot of stories about different shareholder activists and specific approaches, but it probably comes as no surprise that the investor that President I really been focusing on here would be Warren Buffett. But back to the question. Contrary to many other shareholder activists, whenever he bought into American Express, he didn't ask for board seats or for the management to unlock dividends. His key concern was rather that those swindled in the so-called salad oil scandal would be paid back in full. So, Jeff, could you please tell us the story about the salad oil scandal and Warren Buffett's special role?
Sure. And there's also some historical context there, which I'm sure that your listeners will know that before the mid 1960s, Buffett was very much an activist investor, bought these, cigar butts and would get on the board and would advocate for change. It was a real, turning point when he put a quarter of his fund in American Express, because it was just a great franchise, and he thought that the management was mostly doing the right things. Now the swindle is a pretty fascinating financial fraud. So at the time, American Express had their two core businesses. They had the charge card business that was new and growing, and it had the traveler's checks businesses, which was a fabulous business, a mature business, but you got some float out of it. It had incredible returns. But they also had this thing called a field warehousing business. And in that business, they, would essentially guarantee the inventory of companies, So there is this company called Allied Crude Vegetable Oil. They would distribute soybean oil because of the shadiness of the CEO, this guy, Tino DeAngelis, who was a known fraudster with connections to organized crime. They couldn't even open a bank account, and so they had a hard time with borrowing money, and so they used American Express to verify their inventory, so they could borrow against this verified by American Express inventory. And the inventory was these huge big tanks in Bayonne, New Jersey that were supposed to be filled to the brim with soybean oil, but were actually filled with seawater. And this guy Tino perpetrated this big scam where American Express would essentially write him these receipts to verify the inventory. He would use those receipts to open brokerage accounts and to borrow cash. American Express had guaranteed over 1 billion pounds of soybean oil, more than existed in the whole country on paper. And, they were on the hook for a huge amount of money at the time. I think it was about $80 million. that was potentially crippling to Amex. It was particularly damaging to the stock because at the time it was like a joint stock company. It was, well, not a limited liability company. So if you owned shares of American Express and it turned out that they had, like, that they go bust and they have, excess liabilities, like, then you as the shareholder of American Express could be assessed for those liabilities. And so, all these pension funds that owned like American Express panicked and sold out. And so it was a great buying opportunity for Buffett. Like, the way that he saw it was, look, this is an incredible franchise. They made this big mistake. They're going to pay for it, but the value is there and like a long-term compounding machine. But what happened is a collection of shareholders decided to get active with American Express, and they said, well, the warehousing business was at a subsidiary of American Express, and you could file this thing for bankruptcy and not pay these liabilities, and the shareholders would be better off. And Buffett was extremely concerned about this, and he wrote this letter to the chairman of American Express that was like, I'm a very big shareholder. I bought this stake, not because I thought that you would blow off these liabilities, but because of the long-term value that I see in your franchise. The claimants in this fraud were these huge, financial institutions like the Bank of America. And, Buffett saw that if you hose all these claimants, it's going to damage the American Express brand. And so he offered to testify in court that American Express, that it was in their interest to pay these liabilities, and that the activists, shareholders were being extremely short-sighted.
I really love this story, and really tells you something about the development of Warren Buffett. You also mentioned that he started out as an activist, and I guess this was also some sort of an activist play, but something that Icahn would do would be to see if he can take control, because as an investor, you might have the idea that if you are in charge, you are the one who are making the best decisions. But that was not his focus at all. That was basically just to make sure that reputation was intact, and then that the value of the company be the driver or the catalyst for it to reach its intrinsic value once again.
Yeah. It's a neat case because it's clearly a turning point in his career. It's a beginning of his transition to good franchises.
So, Jeff, I can't help but think, now we know how much Warren Buffett is struggling, Icahn, Ross Perot, and they have millions, if not billions of dollars behind them whenever they're trying to influence the management. What can a retail investor do to unlock shareholder value? Say that you only own 100 shares of a stock, but still you're not happy with the management. What do you do?
That's a very good question. And in theory, there should not be complete, disenfranchisement of the small investor. You can put out, shareholder proposals. There are these, big, passive institutions that are thoughtful about them. And if you have a good idea, in theory, they could support it. In practice, that's, really not what happens. It's incredibly rare that you see essentially a retail investor have an impact on governance. The one that pops to mind for me is there was a shareholder in Virginia Dominion Power who was, I think that she was a NASA engineer, and she did a shareholder proposal about sustainable energy practices at the company, and it got broad support from the big institutions. I think to the tune of over $10 billion of a market value. But that was, very much the exception. I think the dirty truth is that corporate America is increasingly controlled by a very concentrated investor base. And it was extremely concentrated in the 20s. It diffused into the 1950s, but beginning in the 60s, it began to reconcentrate. And that, has only continued to happen. So it's incredibly hard for a retail investor to do anything about a company where they think that the governance is bad. If you are a shareholder of a company and you're extremely displeased with the decisions that they're making, your best bet like to intervene is like to call the big shareholders and to try to get them on the phone and to make to make your case. But if that doesn't work, then I think that like you have to consider selling, which is, very tragic.
For people that are listening to the show that might not know this, so Jeff came to our live event that we had in New York City. He was on the panel with us with Toby Carlisle and Wes Gray. And one of the things that came out during the panel discussion was that Jeff's fund that he runs is a very focused portfolio. So he doesn't have a lot of picks in his portfolio, very similar to the way that Buffett has invested through the years, is he has a very focused number of companies that he selects. So Jeff, I've got a hard question for you. So whenever I look at a guy like Bill Ackman, who is also implements this Buffett style approach, who has a very focused portfolio, he had just a terrible last year. I mean, it was, a disaster. When you think about that and you see guys like Ackman go down and just have a horrific year, a lot of people say that that's because they had such a focused portfolio and they didn't have a lot of stocks. We had a discussion with Guy Spear very early on whenever we did our podcast. And the one thing that we asked Guy, we said, hey, what did you learn from the 2008 crash? And Guy said, I was way too focused in only a couple companies and I paid the price for that. How do you feel when you see guys like this? What are your thoughts and opinions on that? Why do you think that that's a better approach for you personally? I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it goes back to that thing like we were talking about with the dispositional fit, like of you and your strategy. Just like the way that I invest, like I'm extremely well focused on downside risk, and I look for the rare situations where like I think I'm completely protected on the downside. I'm not always correct about that, but it's just been the way that works for me. It's like to have like the 10 or 15 positions that I can be completely on top of, and but you're completely right. Like the concentration is incredibly dangerous, and Buffett is, kind of the exception, like that proves like the rule that it's like incredibly hard to do it over like a long career because it's, too easy to blow yourself up. And I think the main danger is, with value investing, it's, so much about like avoiding the big mistakes, keeping sane. The problem with concentration is like when you have a super big position in your portfolio, it's easy to get emotional about it. It's easier to be attached to it. It's easier to have confirmation bias. So sure, the return, can be magnified if you're right. Like that's like what everyone, thinks about. But like all of the psychological, forces against you are magnified if you have like a 20%, position in one stock. And that's extremely dangerous.
Jeff, I got a question for you because I've thought a lot about this. Do you find that businesses that have an individual, specifically a founder, that retains a very large chunk of the voting rights of the business, have a tendency to perform better moving forward than something that has the ownership rights just spread out to low levels, like 1% or less? Do you find that those types of businesses do better when you have that person that's still kind of steering the ship and saying, hey, this is the direction the business needs to go? They've got that sense of what the customer wants. They understand competitive advantage and all this stuff. And they're not just trying to keep the shareholders, the employees, and the customer happy all at the same time. Like I find that when you see a business that has a very focused control of equity, specifically with a founder, they seem to be much more customer and employee focused and don't really care too much about the shareholders, which I think in the end actually takes care of the shareholders better than when a person tries to balance all three of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a fascinating question. And I haven't, looked at it in a scientific way. Pocket of the market that I focus on, which is, very small companies like the microcap world, will more often than not, founder-controlled companies are problematic. Like they're often, vehicles for self-dealing. And I think if you look at bonanza outcomes, like the very successful, that you do see lots of these, founder-run companies. But I think there are fewer of those out there, than what people think. And there are lots of classic founders who took their companies up public and then began to kind of to milk it for their own benefit.
So at this point in time in the show, Jeff, we would like to ask you, what your favorite book recommendation is. And I'm really excited to ask this question of you since you have a value investing background.
Sure. Really loved Joel Greenblatt's Can Be a Stock Market Genius. And like it came at a time in my life where like I didn't, know a lot about investing. And sure, like it taught me like about the spin-offs and the restructurings and like the so-called hiding places in the market that he talks about. But it more gives you this, mindset that there are bargains out there. That book is incredibly good at, debunking the idea of efficient markets, like without like requiring a whole lot of discussion like on that. And then expressing the kind of the treasure hunter mindset of buying a 50-cent dollar. I've read lots of investment books and it's hard to convey, those lessons. And I think that Joel Greenblatt did that extremely well with that book. And I think it holds up still.
So this is hilarious because even the title of the book, we're used to saying the title. So we think that it's normal that the book's title is You Can Be a Stock Market Genius Too. So I'm in my house and I've got, these library shelves of all of my books that I've read. And I'm trying to find this specific book because I'm trying to look something up that's in that book. And so I asked my wife, I said, hey, can you help me find a book? And she says, yeah, what's the title of it? And so I tell my wife, You Can Be a Stock Market Genius. And she literally looked at me and just burst out laughing. She goes, what's the actual name of the book? And she didn't even believe that was the title of the book.
Well, and that like that's like the paperback title. Like, the original title? It's You Can Be a Stock Market Genius even if you're not that smart.
Oh my God.
So they changed that one.
Oh my gosh. Well, you know what? You can't argue with the facts, and the facts is that that's a phenomenal book. I mean, if anybody listening to this hasn't read that one, man, you're missing out. Okay, Jeff, we want people to know where they can find you. Tell them your Twitter handle, tell them the name of your book and where they can find it. Let them know where they can learn more about you.
Sure. The book is called Dear Chairman, Boardroom Battles and the Rise of Shareholder Activism. I'm doing like a lot of events in the coming year. Like I'm going to London, I'm going to Australia, I'm doing a lot in the US. I am on Twitter, Jeff_Gramm, Gramm. I think I met you guys through Twitter, so like it adds value.
You absolutely did. In fact, one of our followers on Twitter said, you got to read this book. It's fabulous. And that's how we got hooked up. So Jeff, such a pleasure having you on the show. We really valued all your input and really enjoyed your book. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come on the Investors Podcast.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys, that was all that Preston and I had for this week's episode of the Investors Podcast. We see each other again next week.
Thanks for listening to TIP. To access the show notes, courses, or forums, go to theinvestorspodcast.com. To get your questions played on the show, go to asktheinvestors.com and win a free subscription to any of our courses on TIP Academy. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making investment decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by the TIP Network. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.
TIP.